because he didn't mention it, but Steve was the series editor. Was it called Environment and Society? Yeah. So there were two books, as I recall it, but he can correct me. Coming out at the same time. One which was a very successful book by John Hannigan called Environmental Sociology, and the second one was mine. And there was at least a third book in the series.
Kay,
that did go to
View from Anthropology.
That was that.
It was a short-lived series.
So there are 3 books in the series.
Exquisite books.
And I'd like to be able to say Steve was actually a very good editor of this book. I remember knocking things backwards and forwards. But I would like to be able to say there was a big tussle between us about the title Citizen Science. That is one question you alluded to already. When did that come in? But, with him arguing it should be called Citizenship and Science, and me arguing it was Citizen Science. But actually, I don't recall that at all in terms of the naming of the book. I don't recall ever fighting. But I do remember you saying, Steve, back then, that the publishers weren't very impressed with a title like Citizen Science because you couldn't really see what the book was all about. Because the label was sort of meaningless for most people 20 years ago. So that's quite a change. And then, I suppose about 5 years ago, I started to notice that Citizen Science was coming up again because a journalist, it seems, also knows, a Danish journalist, rang me up, and she works for a very heavy-duty, it's called Weekend at least, and it's a sort of weekend newspaper, very heavy, the kind of thing that gives no coverage to football whatsoever. And so she rang me, and I'd met her, and she hadn't been very impressed, it was probably fair to say, by her previous meetings with me. And she said, I've just been to a conference in North America, and they say that someone in Denmark invented the term citizen science, and it turns out that it's you. So I thought, okay, that's sort of nice, because this person never really talked to me before. And then as I started to give my views, she kind of cut me off and said, but that's not citizen science, that's the old stuff about science and democracy. I'll have to speak to my editor about that, which I knew perfectly well, what you meant was the story of just being killed. So the idea of citizen science and what it means, as you said very well, Eugénia, is certainly up for grabs. And a lot of people approach this concept that can mean many different things by it. For this presentation, I wanted, if I've got that right, to talk about these 2 different terms, I should go back, citizen science and scientific citizenship, because what I'm trying to say there, I sort of like the picture of oil and water, I suppose, is that each of these terms, both citizen science and scientific citizenship, is open, and you argued this already, Eugénia, to many different interpretations. So it could be, as you already said too, that's part of the appeal to it, that you can pick it up and you can use it in different ways. But I would say, and I very much agree with your argument, that there are certain elements which tie it together, but not everyone will agree with that particular definition, and I'll come back to that in a second. So, citizen science is everywhere. You've already given some examples, Eugénia. I don't need to go over that again, of the kind of places that this is coming up. Some of we've got common ones, and some of them are different. Which is Universe, I can't remember whether you had that one or not. Major web-based thing. European Citizen Science Association, you definitely had that one. The EEA, the European Environment Agency in Copenhagen, certainly using it, for example, working with beekeepers. But I wanted, just for the sake of it, to focus on one conference in citizen science, which at least you attended, Eugénia. You were there. Well, was anyone else in the room there? Okay, so I can say pretty much what I like about it. This was the inaugural Citizen Science Association conference, and if you've got very good eyes, you'll see it was in San Jose in California in February. So 600 people gathered together, a lot of excitement that's already been described around citizen science. And I want to use that just to capture the different meanings that are attributable to citizen science. And I will simply use the 2 keynotes at the conference, because I thought the contrast between the opening keynote and the closing keynote, for me, said it all in terms of the discussion about the meaning of citizen science. So in the usual thing, the big plenary session, as I said, 600 people or so. The opening keynote is given by this guy, Chris Filardi. Chris Filardi is an evolutionary biologist. He is the head of Pacific programs for the American Museum of Natural History. And the work that he was talking about in his account, you can see, this is his title, by the way, and that was one of his PowerPoints just there. You might be able to read it. So the title was A Place in the World, Science, Society, and Reframing the Questions We Ask. So already you get a picture of a certain kind of citizen science. Actually a model which, if I can dare say, in STS terms, feels broadly comfortable. So Chris gave, for me, a very interesting talk about his work on a Pacific island. And the whole point of his story was that working as an evolutionary biologist, that was someone with a special interest in coastal management, he developed an extremely intense relationship. It was actually, Mary Chell, congratulations by the way, like your relationship with the group that you were studying. I mean, here's someone living on an island with the people of the island in a very close relationship. And he's told classic anthropologist type stories, although he wasn't an anthropologist, of every day, for example, the head, the chief, I suppose, would send his daughter with the key to the hut where the equipment was stored. You know, so she would be there to greet him. And after a while, the chief said, you know, many times I thought about throwing this key away because I really didn't want you on this island at all. But now I see that you're someone that we can trust. So it's that kind of story of a close relationship. And as Chris Velarde put it, the point of working in this way, remember he's an evolutionary biologist, not a ethnographer, is that they put me up, this is his phrase, they put me up and put me inside their questioning community. That's the phrase he used. They picked me up and put me inside their questioning community. So there's a model of citizen science working with a very specific group of citizens in a very intense way. I'll just say two more things about Chris Velarde's talk. One was that he said, well, you know, on the island, of course, he was doing a kind of mapping exercise of the local ecology. Certain areas were sacred. And the chief asked me, you know, please could you respect the fact that we simply don't enter those areas. And even though, of course, scientifically, they could be among the most important because they're untouched, he said, of course I wouldn't do something which would break your normal conventions. And equally, he said, in a sort of throwaway line, and how could you even do work in a context like that? Actually, how could you do work on coastal management, which doesn't include working with the people? It just makes no sense. As he said, you know, I can imagine some forms of science that can be done in a back room somewhere, but all the areas of science I know are about working intensively in just this kind of context. So that's one kind of model. I was quite excited to hear this. Actually, he used the book cover of Citizen Science in his talk. I was particularly excited about that. And I went over to him in the break and said, oh, hi, I'm Alan. And this look of panic came onto his face. And he said, but I didn't read all the book. So, second, I didn't expect that. The second talk could not have been more different in terms of style. This is, remember, we're in San Jose, California. So this, for me, was a pure strand of Silicon Valley running through Citizen Science Association. Amy Robinson, that isn't the photo from the presentation, but you kind of get the feeling of sort of Californian enthusiasm, and there's no enthusiasm in the world like California. She was pretty damn enthusiastic. Talking about this thing on the right called iWire. So iWire is a game, basically, with, let me think about this, I think 160,000 people using it. So it's all about gamification, if I can use that expression. And the basic idea is, and it's a familiar one, is that humans are rather good at 3D mapping, this thing that we can do better than computers. So if you can turn the mapping of parts of the human brain into a game, then you can tap into a huge resource. So her language was a completely separate one, power gamers, of intense weekends, of competition between the gamers, and also, of course, the idea that here's a way of doing science in a completely different way. So she was very conscious of and very proud of the fact that this was working with a scientific laboratory, which, if I recall right, was at Stanford, but it just moved to the East Coast somewhere, and getting people to mass participate in that. Obviously, you could say, well, did they think they were engaged in citizen science, or did they not? But she would say that here's a way of getting huge potential, and a lot of excited people, very enthusiastic indeed. So the contrast between the two was pretty striking, and I almost thought you were going to put this PowerPoint up, but you could have done because it's very similar to what you were saying before, Eugénia. You can think of this, here's another way that's very closely related to what we heard previously. This is Mookie Hackley, pretty well known in the area of citizen science these days. Doing it as a series of levels. You had types, I think, but these are levels. And the bottom level is crowdsourcing, citizens as sensors, moving up through distributed intelligence, participatory science, and then what I found very interesting, level 4 was called extreme. Extreme. Collaborative science, problem definition, data collection, and analysis. So one way of thinking about it, of course, is to say, well, you've got different types of citizen science. iWire and the gamification stuff is using ideas of crowdsourcing or possibly distributed intelligence, probably more crowdsourcing, I would say. And then the presentation from Chris, the evolutionary biologist, is moving closer to participation or ideas of collaborative science. And there you can say something about citizen science, but of course, and has already been suggested, we have to think about the fact that as STS scholars in particular, we're trying to look at these things critically. I mean, from whose perspective is this a model? It seems to me that this kind of idea very much fits with the idea of a scientific perspective on these things. So what might look extreme from this perspective in terms of collaboration, from the point of view of citizenship, of people actually being involved, could look very different. I don't think the islanders in the Pacific thought that they were being extreme when they talked. They were just doing what they do. They were just living lives in a context where scientists were coming into close collaboration. I mean, whoever called that extreme, it's a very peculiar definition indeed. Also, of course, you could divide up citizen science in some totally different ways. I mean, there's nothing here about the kind of organizations that are involved in citizen science. I mean, who's doing it? Or indeed about where the motivation for citizen science comes from. So you can say that one definition, and this is based on a chapter I've written, that's why the quote is actually from me, but I just wanted to write it down. You could say that the defining characteristic of citizen science is its location at the point where public participation and knowledge production meet. And that intersection can take many different forms. You could read that into these kinds of categorizations. But I have to say, and I'm very much in line with you here, that that definition already is a challenging one, because many of the things which, as you argue, which is many of the activities within citizen science are actually trying to separate those two things. Many people who do research in the area of citizen science will stress that the most important thing is that we don't confuse these things, we don't confuse the citizenship expression and the knowledge production expression, that we keep them apart. Whereas, like Eugénia, I would want to argue, but it's actually the point where they meet that's interesting. And that, of course, even in the relatively modest form, like level 1 crowdsourcing, is already happening. I mean, there you've got it intersects in the sense of trying to build a barrier between the two things, to keep these things apart. Whereas potentially, at least, at level 4, in the collaborative science, you can see a greater acknowledgement, certainly there in Chris Falagi's talk, that you simply can't separate these things. It would be a nonsense in the context of his study in the Pacific to do it that way. But that got me thinking a lot about the relationship between citizen science and ideas of scientific citizenship. Another term that I said at the beginning is open to many definitions. And as I said in the title, are they the same words, different meanings? But also, what is the relationship then between citizen science and ideas of wider citizenship? And that made me think about the potential, the significance, not just of the starting point, so to say, of a citizen science engagement, whether it's iWire, the 3D gamification, or the Pacific Island, but what potential for movement does one see in these situations? After all, someone could engage with issues of gamification because you're having a fun time playing a game, all day, all weekend, sitting in your underpants. It's possible to do it. But if that then makes you think about, well, hang on, what's the relationship between Silicon Valley and science? Or what is this stuff to do with the human brain? Where's that actually leading? It could actually lead to all sorts of citizenship expressions. So we shouldn't just look at it in this kind of flat, categorical way, but we also need to think about what's the potential for movement. And I also would say that whilst Chris Filardi, as you can probably tell, I felt broadly sympathetic to his account. I mean, it's one which we might think about ourselves in, again, in STS terms. You know, what's to stop his idea of working deeply with the local community ending up as a project to say, well, you know, how can we basically exploit the people on that island in order to build better forms of, make better forms of medicine, for example. So it's not necessarily the case that the starting point is the end point. I guess it's the potentiality of citizen science which interests me, therefore, and particularly the possibility that by starting in relatively modest examples, it might take you somewhere else. So then I move over in the second part of my talk. How am I doing for time?
You have 12 minutes left.
Fantastic, perfect. To the discussion of scientific citizenship, you know, asking the question, to what extent can citizen science offer us something new in the area of scientific citizenship? And there I've got a quote from Melissa Leach and Ian Scrims and Brian Wynn, arguing that the relationship between science and citizenship is more permanent than ever. This would be true in just about any date you could possibly fix, by the way. I'm not saying it's necessarily something true now, but it's also true now, even if it's also true in other historical periods. So now we move into the world of scientific citizenship, a world which typically uses a rather different language than the language of citizen science. I must say, going back to the Citizen Science Association meeting, one of the most interesting things was down in the basement somewhere, there were individual stands, you know, people with posters talking about this citizen science project. And I learned more about earthworms in 10 minutes than I learned in the rest of my life put together. I mean, these people are really deeply passionate about earthworms when they're doing a citizen science work, and all the other examples. But there wasn't much talk about global warming, or about climate change, or about, GMOs. Global warming and climate change kind of go together. About GMOs, or about BSE, etc. The classic kind of discussions about scientific citizenship that come up. It seems that it's at a different level. So if you think about scientific citizenship, you can feel it's asking questions often in a very different genre, in a very different discourse, a very different way of thinking about these things, compared to the excitement you see, for example, at the Citizen Science Association. I agree with you again, I keep agreeing with you, that very little discussion about the citizen part of citizen science. It's usually a focus on the scientific element. Very little, apart from possibly in Chris Filardi's talk, about democracy, although I don't actually remember him using the democracy word. But you can see, of course, a potential for citizen science if you think about it in citizenship terms. And I'm just assuming that we are interested in pursuing it in citizenship terms, in terms of actually bringing citizens into close contact with forms of science to some degree on their own terms. I mean, rather than simply engaging in the more traditional means through science communication or organised public engagement exercises that much has been written about, you can see something in there where people are dealing literally, in the case of the Worm Project, hands-on. I mean, they're getting their hands dirty in every sense. And that this rapid pursuit that I wrote. So you could see this as a kind of practiced engagement of not just simply trying to have a broad, rather ideological discussion about the best relationship between science and democracy, but actually leading very specifically by example. And you could also see it to some degree, at least at the level of potential, of bringing arguments about justice. I mean, you can think of citizen science and arguments about environmental justice is, again, sounding very different. But if the stimulus for people to get involved in citizen science activities, bless you, is a sense that, I think that was a sneeze, is the sense that something is not quite right in the world, you can see how that could have implications in terms of discussions of justice of the kind that those writers have brought in. So let me finish basically by throwing out two questions. One is the sort of, I guess it's the analytical question, and the other one is about its potential. I mean, is citizen science simply about producing science in non-conventional ways, or could it have a larger role with regard to citizenship? Well, if you go back to that Hackley categorization, and much as I hate to be predictable, you certainly at a conference like the Citizen Science Association hear much more at the level 1 or level 2, if you just take that categorization, which I've already criticized, than you ever do level 3 or level 4. I think Hackley's notion of extreme citizen science as being about collaboration in many ways says it all. So you can look very skeptically at these manifestations of citizen science and precisely say, where's the discussion about citizenship? Where's the discussion about justice? Where's the discussion about wider societal change? I mean, where's the politics in citizen science, put very bluntly? Most of the time, you won't hear it. So that's one example. In a recent report, we were suggesting that it's necessary to think about how it would be possible to create space within a scientific career, for example, to allow room for reflection on citizen science activities. So they have the potential to create those sorts of effects, rather than simply being an extension of science by other means. But if you go to the second question about how could citizen science facilitate the wide development of scientific citizenship, I guess I won't go all the way through that. There you go. You can certainly see areas, and I think, again, Eugénia, I'm broadly with you here, you might or might not agree, in terms of the way in which citizen science has potential in terms of scientific citizenship. The idea of distributing expertise. I mean, some folks might see a sort of mode 1, mode 2 thing going on here, that science is now practiced outside of standard institutions. This is a phenomenon you can point to in many areas of life. The fact that citizen science projects, and Chris Velarde's particularly demonstrates that, but even I think the IWire project has a kind of mixing together of different things, which, so it's a bringing together of science into society, I guess. There's something about the practiced engagement of citizen science which attracts me, particularly when it's being engaged in issues of science and society beyond the level of sitting talking about it, but actually doing stuff. I mean, there's something there that actually citizenship discussions could learn from citizen science, that it's not just about, you know, attending a public debate about the future of xenotransplantation. You're actually doing things, and a lot of the spark, which I can't be cynical about when I'm talking to people at the posters, I can't be cynical about the energy that they have and the way in which people have seen potential where they probably didn't do it before. Whether there's scientific institutional and citizenship learning going on, it's really harder to say. I don't see so many scientific institutions reflecting deeply on citizen science, but many scientists are excited by the extension possibilities. But I don't hear many scientists, Chris Velarde for me would be an exception, thinking about, well, how can we change? So let me finish with a number of points about the potential. I think to do the sorts of things which I'm talking about, and I realise I've used a very broad concept in scientific citizenship, the idea of citizen science as a provocation seems to be important. The idea that in some sense it can be unsettling to establish ways of thinking. There is some reflection about that, but mainly it's simply as an extension. For citizen science to have these wider implications, I think it's also important that it isn't simply controlled by scientific institutions in the way it is now. Now, I think it's actually fine if scientific institutions are willing to engage in citizen science activities. I wouldn't be against that. But it can't always be like that. It can't always, to go back to that categorization, be seen from the perspective of scientific institutions. It also has to be something which makes sense in terms of citizenship. I think Eugénia argued this very well. I don't really need to repeat this. The citizenship dimension tends to be underplayed. Actually, it's something I noticed with public engagement exercises also. There's a lot of attention to getting the science right within a public engagement exercise. We've got to be sure that we communicate what xenotransplantation or GM technology is all about. But there's nowhere the same attention to what model of citizenship are we using in this. That's somehow just taken for granted. As long as it's factually accurate, it feels like the most important thing is covered. But the citizenship dimension is crucial. And of course I'm arguing that citizen science should provoke some discussion, but perhaps it does it in a more grounded, more localized way. Perhaps it isn't about articles in the Danish newspapers, but more about people in very specific circumstances. I like the idea of bringing concepts like justice into this. I like the concept of epistemic justice, mainly because of its disturbance quality. We can argue about what epistemic justice means, but I think putting that into discussion about citizen science raises a whole set of questions which are typically excluded right now. Institutional learning from this, well, there are a lot of pressures in terms of academic career structures, the globalization of research, which you could see as pushing against this kind of wider engagement exercises. That also needs to be recognized in order for citizen science to become some kind of space for science-citizen relations. Right now, as I said, the enthusiasm for citizen science is usually as an extension of science, but this is my final point. But perhaps if one is looking in terms of potentiality, you can see that as gaining some kind of leverage, some kind of possibility. Perhaps the enthusiasm which exists within citizen science could provoke these kind of discussions. It might not be there right now, but it may be something which could develop in the future. Thank you.